In the video today, I will be walking you through why the idea of World War III, as it's been bandied about in the media and online for the last 20 years, is so asinine and idiotic. We have this claim to war that the media enjoys because they are able to what is functionally engagement bait. And essentially, we can think of war in a few ways, but in general, modern war is always a nuclear armed government versus a non-nuclear armed government or state. There's almost no instances of two nuclear holding or armed states who would actually go to war against one another. Obviously, the threat of assured destruction is something that prevents those things from happening. A trilogy of wars, world wars, is only logical because we've had two. Now, this is not movies. This is not a Lord of the Rings or a Dune or a series where we need to necessarily publish one extra version of this with the same thematics. War, as it stands, has always been fought, not generally, but specifically. And you could have called what was the Napoleonic Wars world wars, because functionally anyone who was involved was the world at that point in time from a economic or cultural point of view. In saying that, I think it's just really bothersome to have to listen to this incessant garbage spewing out and bloviating from what is a very, I'd say, understudied and unequivocally annoying journalist class. And so we'll try and dispel the entire premise today in one go. And so first we can just have a look at why anyone would think that America would go to war, or anyone would go to war with America is potentially a better way to say that. So if we look at the American presence, military presence globally, you have what is effectively an entire empire worth of bases, military bases, not including the naval capabilities. So they're obviously having very many submarines and aircraft carriers, both nuclear and non-nuclear, abroad at any given point. Then they have effectively ring-fenced Russia. So you have NATO and several bases in Eastern Europe, which allow for constant monitoring. So there's 30, but I'm sure there's more, 30 surveillance drones and or planes at any given point, patrolling what is the border there between Russia and the rest of the European continent. The same thing can be said of China, whereby there's another ring fence where you're making sure that the Chinese sea is a contested sea rather than their own sovereign sea, because you can claim, due to what you see down here, is certain islands being out of the realm of ownership for China. China itself obviously trying to instate and come to grips with the reality of a global political power, and America trying to hem them in as best as possible with the sheer, you could say, first mover advantage that they've had, but scale of the military capabilities. Being the first mover and being able to sustain that momentum is and has given America basically the foothold and primacy in global politics. There is no one to compare. I think it's very, very stupid of anybody to think that something so silly as China and Russia competing against the world is an actual feasible scenario. These two countries are backwaters, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense necessarily so, but in the comparative sense of, if you think other than having nuclear weapons that there would be any war other than an invasion of their actual country that they would win, then you are sadly mistaken. The Korean War showed that you can't just invade, even with a significant and overpowering arms, willy-nilly into Asia. I think Vietnam reasserted that fact. But that's already utilizing the local populace as a fighting force, particularly a guerrilla fighting force. Guerrilla and insurgencies, they are fought in different methods. Something like Iraq and Afghanistan was also a very good clue as to what the importance of war is when you don't have a definite goal. If you're trying to remove a government and replace it, the goal is fairly ephemeral once you've done that. You can say like George Bush did and thumbs up, mission accomplished, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to have conflict and issues further on. So I don't think we want to necessarily say that America is bad at wars because of, look at Afghanistan, look at Vietnam, look at Korea, and look at Iraq. I think what we would say is that they never really intended to win those wars in a classical sense. There was no defeat of the enemy. It was completely within the realms of capabilities for America to absolutely just glass the entire country of Iraq and just concrete over it and call it a car park. So it's not like we think that there was an equivalent power struggle here. It's that it was a protracted insurgent force which affected casualties on a not as committed over the decade American and coalition fighting force. Sure, we'll grant that notion, but to say, yeah, but we have to be ready for when Russia rolls over the Eastern European borders is stupid. It is literally moronic. You can hearken your thoughts back to World War II and say, well, it was done then. Couldn't it be done now? Obviously, once again, the threat of nuclear armament and assured destruction prevents Russia and America from wanting to have anything to do with waltzing in and trying to occupy some of these territories. It's just unnecessary. There is nothing in Russia other than oil and gas. It is, if we look at their economy, I don't have it here. Oh, yes, I do. I at least have their exports, and you can see here the exports for Russia are $232 billion as of last year. And the majority of that was crude petroleum, refined petroleum, natural gas, coal, wheat, and iron. This could have been the economy of a 1922 Russia. That's how advanced this economy is. It is a backwater. And once again, this is not an indictment of Russians. It's just that their economy is smaller than Italy's. This is a tiny, insignificant economy that, if they were not the vestige of the USSR and did not have nuclear arms, we would never talk about them. Their civil strife and occupation of the Crimea is only because there's nothing else to talk about internationally in the politics realm. If we had actual proper problems, we wouldn't be talking about anything in the Middle East, and we wouldn't be talking about anything in Central Asia, which is effectively very, very Eastern Europe. These things are so unimportant to us, but because there's a lack of perspective here, we've been in such a pacifist peacetime deal that we had to find wars in the early 2000s to actually invent and then pursue. And now we have to talk about wars no one actually really cares about except the participants. So this is where we are here, and why it bothers me so much. I think I should try and relax, but I'm incapable of that. I'm highly strung when it comes to having to participate online and in real life on these discussions about topics which are just balderdash. The idea of World War III then, I think, is also dumb from the comparative sense of who would even fight who here. It's one thing to say like, well, yeah, you'll have NATO versus Russia. And then we look and we go, yeah, actually, you know what? If I look at NATO and Russia, I'm seeing a child versus a grown man. And other than what you would have in terms of nuclear arms, it's very easy to see why a conflict that was outside of Russian borders would be a one-way affair. This is an unstoppable object meeting a very movable space. Yeah. So then you could say China would reinforce Russia, but why would China do that? Because China's communist, Russia's notionally democratic and capitalist. So the ties are historic, and the historic ties probably outweighed by the fact that the United States is about 15% of Chinese exports. China wants to establish itself regionally to play a long game. They're trying to be the 2100 power, not necessarily 2050. They would not jeopardize this. They have much more benefits and a longer term sinecure when it comes to planning these things. They take these 5-year plans and they add them together, and like Lego blocks, they end up building the society or the future that they want. Whether they're successful or not will come down to many external circumstances and happenings. But as it stands, they're at least in control of their own ability to invade or pursue international warfare. And they wouldn't bother. There would have to be a very serious direct threat to their own sovereignty for them to bother joining Russia in anything other than supplying them with goods. They're the world's plastic and toy maker, and to a degree some industrial productivity around steel and refined technologies. But other than that, they once again do not produce that much other than what is a functional and consumer good. So you have on one hand a sweatshop, on the other hand a gas station, competing against what is effectively the world's biggest economy to have ever existed, with the world's biggest military, most functional military to have ever existed. They are not comparable. This is pure drivel. The thought experiment you could do just to see, okay, well, let me see how equivalent all these things is. Maybe I'm being flippant. Think of how long it would take America to occupy Canada if there was an exact Crimea situation. America would steamroll Canada in less than a day, probably 12 hours if they planned it effectively. Even if Canada knew it was coming, maybe it takes 2 days. They are such a supreme fighting force in comparison to anyone else that their neighbors, in the real sense, if we took it as a actual experimental simulation, would be kaput. It would be not even worth discussing. It would be 3 days of on the news of Canada occupied to America has instated a new Canadian government. It's not to say there wouldn't be insurgents and guerrilla warfare and all this type of stuff, but the occupation and then replacement of a government, which is, I would say, ostensibly the way that you go about at this point in time, a strategic victory on those terms, is very, very possible and feasible within a week, but 3 days, I would say, at worst. 12 hours was what it would take to roll those tanks into every Canadian city. And it would be very surprised if Canadians didn't surrender anyway. So in saying that, I think it's obvious that the Ukraine presents a much more difficult task. Even an armed Canada from, say, China and Russia were shipping arms to Canada would not equate in a meaningful defense. So my last point here, I think, is around how you can interact with this stuff is to just not bother. Once someone starts talking in World War III terms, they're just throwing out nonsense garbage to bait you into something. They want you to click on it. They want you to research on it. And I know the contradiction here is obviously I'm now also committed to discussing this, but hopefully mine is the full stop at the end of the sentence of looking and bothering and thinking about this. It is so foolish that I will stop before I go on another tirade and just say that it is never going to happen.